everybody, I'm Anja. I'd like to tell you a Christmas story about my grandmother, who was my mother's mother. And she was born Selma Marie Jones on Mount Pettigene in Arkansas, which is in the southern United States. And none of you have probably ever heard of Mount Pettigene, but it's actually a national park now, one of the few that's left in that country. And the name Pettigene is actually the American pronunciation of the name Petit Jean, which means Little John. And there's actually a pretty neat story behind the name of this mountain, but I'm going to have to leave that for another day. But I think it's safe to assume that it's a tragic story because people don't name mountains after happy endings. So Selma grew up on Mount Pettigene, born 1914, so just over 100 years ago, and she was the fourth of 7 children raised by a German family that had emigrated to the United States. And they were poor. I mean, everybody in the South was poor in the 1910s. But they were getting by. They had a little farmhouse with a plot of land around it on which they were able to grow just enough food and raise just enough animals to survive. And they'd set aside a plot of land that they used to grow cotton. And they would sell that cotton to get enough cash to buy all the things that they couldn't make or grow or create themselves. So they were able to get things like fabric for clothes, tools, kitchenware, sugar, salt, things that you couldn't make yourself. But they were basically just eking by. 7 kids, it was hard to survive. And a typical Christmas for them was not the lavish affair that we experience nowadays with mountains and mountains of superfluous toys and gimmicks. Their gifts were always practical and useful and sensible and usable, and nothing was ever superfluous. So a typical gift one year was the 3 older daughters were each given a new dress that their mother had sewn for them. And she'd bought the fabric and spent months preparing these dresses. So in a sense, it was actually a very big gift because they were about to outgrow their last dress because you only had one outfit at a time. And the oldest daughter, Augusta, got a blue dress, and her younger sister, Julia, got a green dress, and Selma was given a yellow dress. Now, Selma's coloring was similar to mine, and I look absolutely horrible in yellow, and so did Selma. And she was very resentful about the fact that she had to wear a yellow dress until she outgrew it. It was her only dress that she wore every single day. And if it needed to be washed, basically she was stuck at home until it was dry enough to wear again. And she was also a very stubborn woman, and she refused to wear the color yellow for the rest of her life. This was her one and only article of clothing that she ever owned. So the family was getting by. They were okay. They had enough to eat. They went to school, which was important because their mother believed that education was almost as important as religion. And they were okay until disaster struck in 1928, which is when their papa died of stomach cancer. And the medical healthcare was pretty much non-existent on the mountain. And the family watched him slowly starve to death over the course of months. And there was nothing anyone could do for him, so they slowly watched him die until finally he gave up the fight, and he died in the same bed that his children had been born in. And when Selma later talked about her father's death, she truly believed they were going to die too. They really believed that without a man to run the farm and to take care of them and to get them through this, they were actually going to starve to death right with him. And when he died, he left his widow with 7 children who were between the ages of 2 and 18. And they had no choice but to continue working on the farm, so they did what they could. One thing that did help was they had one very valuable asset on the farm, which was a mule. And they used this mule not only to transport goods from one place to another and to ride it to school and back and to pull their wagon, but they also used it to plow the cotton field. And the harvest season after their papa died, they had to hire a farmhand to help out with the plowing. And he thought that the mule was too hot working in the sun, and he, with the best of intentions, came with a freezing bucket of water and dumped it on the mule, which was too much for the animal in the heat, and it died right there on the field. And it left the Joneses with nothing to do other than to just keep plowing with their bodies and transporting things with their hands, and they had to make do because you can't just buy another mule. They're very expensive animals. So just when the family thought things couldn't possibly get any worse, in 1929, in the fall, the US stock market collapsed, and they entered what is now known as the Great Depression. So even what little money they did have saved from their labor was now worthless. And that Christmas Eve, 1929, the family was about as low as it could possibly be when they all met in the little kitchen of their farmhouse in Mount Pettigene to celebrate Christmas Eve. They were German, so they did Christmas Eve, not Christmas morning like other Americans. So they found themselves in the kitchen at the absolute low point, close to starving to death, with no hope for the future. And they weren't expecting anything because they knew they had nothing to give. And their mother, to their great surprise, produced 7 gifts, 1 for each child. And they were absolutely out of their minds with joy because they weren't expecting anything, and here every one of them was going to get their own gift. And they started unwrapping them, and all the presents were very sensible, useful, practical, everyday items, but they didn't care. They were happy to get anything new. Anything new in their lives was a good and welcome change. Except for Selma, who had actually been struggling the most, and her mother knew that she really was having a hard time with her papa having died. It was her main parent. It was her person. And Selma was struggling the most, so her mother gave her a bottle of perfume. Now, I suspect there's a story behind how she was able to get this bottle of perfume, but unfortunately nobody thought to ever ask her. But she gave Selma this beautiful bottle, and it was cut glass, and it was absolutely spectacular in the eyes of these 7 children. And Selma couldn't believe it. I mean, she was so excited about something. She'd never had anything this luxurious or this unnecessary before. So she jumped up with the bottle in her hand and started running across the kitchen to put some on her sisters. And as she was running across the kitchen, she tripped and flung out her arms to catch her balance. And with her hand, with the bottle in it, she struck the corner of the big iron stove. And the bottle smashed in her hand, irreparably broken. And that was the moment that was too much for her. She'd been keeping it together through Papa's death, the death of the mule, through the loss of the economy, through this absolute fear and hopelessness, and it all just got too much for her. And for the first time since her father's death, she just broke down and cried. And she cried like the world was ending, because to her, at 15, the world actually was ending. And her mother and her brothers and sisters didn't even try to comfort her, because they knew there was no silver lining, and it wasn't okay, and there was nothing they could say to her to take away this loss. But what they did do is they hugged her, and they held her, and they cried with her. And all 8 of them spent Christmas Eve, 1929, lying on the floor of the kitchen crying together. Now, when Selma told the story later on, and also when I had the same story told by her siblings, what's interesting is they don't focus on the broken bottle or the disappointment or the fear or the hunger. What they remember the most is the sense of solidarity and unity, and the feeling that no matter how bad things got there, at least they were in it together. And you had, 8 other people or 7 other people that felt the same way you did, and that you weren't going to get stuck in this alone. And that night, that Christmas Eve, something changed for the Jones kids. And shortly after, Henry, who was the oldest, he was 19 at the time, got a job at a gas station, working on the mountain on a gas station. And the younger siblings all continued working on the farm, and they took turns paying for each other to go to college. The only one of them that never got to go was Henry, because his job at the gas station was essential, but the other 6 all got to go to college, including the 4 girls, which was extraordinary for women at the time, especially in that region. And they all became teachers. And Bill, the second oldest son, became a Lutheran minister, and he worked a lot with the poorer Black communities in the American South. And he became personal friends with Martin Luther King Sr., so the father of Dr. King, and he was involved in all the civil rights marches in the South at the time, and he was good friends with both the Kings. And his younger brother, Paul, like his sister, became a teacher, and he was the principal of the largest high school in St. Louis, Missouri, which was the high school that was at the center of the desegregation protests. And my mom remembers watching her Uncle Paul on TV thinking he's going to get shot by some hillbilly, but he didn't. He actually survived this. In fact, nobody in the family was ever in that kind of danger or peril or fear or just being that stuck again. It never happened again. The closest to disaster anyone in the family ever came again was Selma herself, who when she was in her 40s and married with 2 children, was living on a farm in Nebraska and doing well. It was a nice German-style house. And everyone had told them, don't build 2-story houses in the Midwest. And they said, no, we need a nice German-style house. So they built a nice, tall 2-story farmhouse, the German style. And when my mother was 16, a tornado hit the house. And they learned why you don't build 2-story houses in Nebraska. But it was a relatively small disaster because everybody survived and they had insurance. And my grandmother's and my grandfather's siblings all showed up within hours to rebuild the farm. So that was the closest anyone ever got to disaster again. And all the descendants of the 7 Jones kids are doing fine. Everybody got up and everybody got out. And amongst the grandchildren of the 7, there are 2 lawyers, an award-winning documentary filmmaker, a doctor, a nurse, a pilot, countless teachers, many successful farmers, and me. I never ever have this context again, so I have to say, God bless us, everyone!